welcome everyone, good evening. And welcome to the latest edition of the Joy Chip Reading Project. And this book discussion, I'm your host, James Edward Mills. And today I'm pleased to introduce to you this month's author, my very good friend, Audrey Peterman. Now, we're gonna discuss her book, From My Jamaica Gully to the World and Back. Now, this discussion is particularly important today because we're celebrating another fabulous season of women's history in the month of March. And no one has a better history for the environmental movement than my friend Audrey.
Oh, thank you, James.
Of course. Now, of course, I look forward to our discussion today. But before we dive into our conversation, I'd like to first of all acknowledge that I'm screening into you tonight from Madison, Wisconsin, which is the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, known for time immemorial as Dejope. Now, wherever you are in North America, please make sure that you acknowledge the Native people that once called where you live now home. Also, I would like to thank the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, as well as the financial contributions of the Schleck Family Foundation, the National Geographic Society, the National Park Service, who provide us with funds for our speakers so that each month we can provide a modest stipend, because I personally believe that friends don't let friends work for free. Also, for those of you who are not familiar with me personally or the Joy Chip Project, I'm a freelance journalist and I have a specialty as an independent media producer in outdoor recreation and environmental conservation, but I have a further specialty in covering issues of racial diversity, equity, and inclusion in the management of public land. And I work at the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to teach a class called Outdoors for All. And it's essentially an undergraduate study class that I teach that discusses for students an opportunity to understand how public lands are managed. And it's also an opportunity to engage with and address the interests of the authors that we feature on this, this event every month. Now, before we get started, one last thing. I also want to make sure that we are going to take the time to put questions into the chat. So please, if you have a looming question that you'd like to share with our guests, please don't hesitate to ask. And as I mentioned before, as you're coming in, please share with us where you're from and what is making you happy. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest tonight, Audrey Peterman. She is the co-founder and president of Earthwise Production. She is also a nationally renowned author and advocate for the National Park System. She is widely recognized as a leader in efforts to celebrate the diversity of Americans in our natural and cultural treasures, as well as on our public lands. She speaks prolifically around the country on the benefits of our land and water resources and shares them widely through social media. Without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to my friend, Audrey Peterman.
Thank you so much, James. I'm so appreciative. Thank you.
Well,
and I really feel like I should be congratulating you big time because you just made National Geographic Explorer. And that's a very big deal on top of all your, well, it encapsulates all your accomplishments.
Well, thank you. No, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And as I was saying when we were chatting a minute ago, you know, I think I have as much to thank you for anything that I've accomplished, because you've really laid the groundwork for a lot of the vitally important work of public land management, especially when it comes to the interests of people of color and their relationship with the outdoors. Now, I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for audience questions, but really what I'd like to do is make sure that I ask you some very specific questions about your book, which I really enjoyed. And I think the thing that I loved most about your book was the entire section on how you describe the Gully. And it seems like it's just a beautiful, lush place with water and greenery. I'm really curious to know how much of that early influence in your life in a very natural setting to help define for you all the things that influenced you to become an environmentalist.
100%. 100%, James. Because I tell people that I grew up in that proverbial village, you know, the village that it takes to raise a child. You know, I really actually never heard a harsh word in my childhood. And I grew up our house was on the bank of that gully, and the gully came from up in the mountains. And as children, we didn't really care that much where it came from, right? We just loved splashing around in the gully. And I was lucky enough to have a deep hole behind my house. That is a place where the bottom of the gully kind of like depressed, and so the water accumulated more, even though it kept flowing downstream. And so most of my friends would come to swim and splash around in that deep hole. And it was so beautiful because we had a mango tree overhanging the deep hole. And in mango season, all these ripe mangoes would just fall off the tree, or as children, we would throw stones at them, and knock them off, and they would come just floating down the river, and we would like chase ourselves and, struggle to get mangoes. But always there was a feeling that there was enough and more than enough for everybody. So I never had to compete for anything in my childhood. And then also sitting on the banks of the gully, because I was an only child. So the times when my friends had gone, I sometimes sat on the banks of my gully by myself, and I watched the fish and the little marine creatures in the water, in their own world, and I was in my own world, and I could feel the breeze on my face. I could hear the birds scratching in the underbrush. It was just magical, and I spent a lot of time in that place, and I did not know it until I took on this effort with regards to the national park system and environment in America. But I really believe that in those formative years, in that formative place, I became completely bonded and one with nature.
Yeah, and what I really love about the story that you tell in your book is that your was it your grandfather who planted your umbilical cord
Yes,
next
under
to
my breadfruit tree.
a breadfruit tree,
Yes,
and it's still there.
it's still there, and my breadfruit tree is still growing and producing breadfruit. Yes.
Yeah, and I love that tradition. Tell us about how that literally grounds you in this place that you call home.
Well, just knowing that I literally have roots, right? I have literally roots. People are always looking for their roots. I can go and point to where mine is. I can go and hug my breadfruit tree. So I think it all contributed to my feeling of security and groundedness, that I have that legacy. And my breadfruit tree is still thriving 71 years later, and so am I.
And
I'm so
I love
grateful.
hearing that. I really love hearing that, especially
Yes.
because you're back in Jamaica now.
Yes.
As the book implies,
Yes.
literally have gone from Jamaica and back again.
Yes.
And we'll get back to what your present holds, but I want to talk a little bit more about your past. And what I really enjoyed was learning more about your mother, who you described in the second chapter as a higgler.
Yes.
And based on what she did to make ends meet, she was an entrepreneur. And
Right.
what I would call her is a hustler.
Right.
Someone who really gets out there and does what needs to be done. I mean, how much of your mother's influence do you think was
Actually,
critical in becoming the very staunch and entrepreneurial advocate that you become for the natural world?
actually, that was my grandmother. My mother actually had me when she was a teenager. And so she went away to Kingston to work and earn a living. And I grew up with my grandmother, my grandma Ida. And I will tell you, there was an unpleasant experience I mentioned in the book when I woke up one night to the sound of my grandfather hitting my grandmother. It was so bizarre. And I ran in there to try to rescue her, of course, and I was beating on his legs with my little fist. And he actually took off his belt and walloped me a few times because he said if I was older, I would be fighting him for my grandmother. And I'm telling you this story because it's very, very important. So the next day he went off to work, and my grandmother just went about business as usual. And then in the middle of the next night, she came to me in the bed and she woke me up and she said, "Quiet, get up, we're leaving." And just like that, we left that place. We went out in the dead of night. She was carrying a bottle torch, right? and she had to suppress the light until we got up to the road. And then I don't remember how much time later, one of her relatives came and picked us up and took us away farther down to the village where her people lived. But I learned from that, even though things can seem perfect, they might not always be. And the other big lesson was, you don't have to suffer, okay? You don't have to be put upon. You don't have to be taken advantage of. So you're out of there. And that has really stood me in good stead my whole life. But my grandmother now, who was not a particularly, not an educated woman at all, she had to find a way to support us. And so she became a higgler. She would buy things like oranges and vegetables from the surrounding community. And then she would get on a truck that took her all the way to the sea at a place called Rocky Point. And then she would sell those vegetables and buy fish and come back home and sell the fish to the neighborhood. It was I mean, she was just unbelievable. Yeah, she gives me strength even today.
Wow. And how old is she now?
She's gone now. She's
Okay,
been
I wasn't
gone.
100% certain. And
Yes,
so what
yes,
I find fascinating though is that, your entire pedigree is about overcoming adversity. It's all about standing up for your rights and privileges as a human being, and that continued to be true through your early college education, and getting started as a professional. What was it like, becoming a young journalist or a young um, uh, communications professional at that time as you're beginning to develop your career as a professional?
right. And here's the thing, I don't actually see adversity, I feel like so fortunate in my life in terms of getting a high school education, as you mentioned. That didn't have to happen. So many young people didn't have that opportunity, but I did. And then when I saw the notice in the newspaper that they were going to be hiring sub-editors, I hurried to apply for that because I'd always had a dream of being a reporter, and I was a pretty good writer. So I was actually chosen among, I think, about six of us out of 300 applicants. So that was just, it was idyllic. It was so wonderful to be able to be part of the lifeblood, the information stream of my country, and to be accepted. There was no discrimination or lack of acceptance anywhere in my experience. So it was really very wonderful. And then, of course, in the manly years when our country started turning towards socialism and there was a lot of upheaval, that's the time when I left in the 1978, in fact, and went to the United States. And my mother had already migrated. So when I got to the US, I picked up my green card at the airport, me and my daughter. And that's a very big deal because so many people think that, people want to go to America as illegal immigrants. And it has to be understood that leaving your homeland and going to America, you only do it if you don't have another choice, if you don't have the opportunity to stay comfortably in your home, right? And also to seek more opportunity. So that's what I was doing. But the fact that some people had to come and stay illegally, like my mother came as a visitor, and then she had to stay illegally until she could afford enough money to pay a lawyer to get her immigration status changed. So, in all ways, I benefited.
Mm. And from that, I mean, had a kind of a variety of different careers, doing a variety of different things. Tell
Yeah.
us how you met Frank, your
Oh
husband.
God. Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes. So I was actually, I don't want to say desperate, but I really needed to make money, right? And so I was working with my friend who had a secretarial service, and her gig was to have people reroute their phones to her place, so they could have a live person answer it. But Florida wages are cheap. Nobody needed that service because everybody could afford to have somebody in their office. Then one day, in walked this guy, and I can tell you, the light bounced off of him. He was so perfect. He was so wonderful, and he had come to get his book retyped, right? So this guy was not only gorgeous, he was brilliant. He had written a book and everything. I was so smitten. But guess what? It was so funny. I I was terrified of becoming anything other than a friend to him because I thought, well, if you cross that line of intimacy and then it doesn't work out, then you've lost your friend, right? So I tried to fix him up with all my eligible girlfriends. And I went on dates with them sometimes it was so terrible. But eventually, 7 years later, he said to me, uh, and 6 months later, we were married. And it's been 30 years now. This year's going to be 31, and it's better than ever.
Wow. I really love hearing that story. And for those of you who haven't met Frank, he's the happiest guy I know.
Yes.
He really is. You know, I am not looking for the day where I see him frown. I've always see him with a smile on his face, and he's just an amazing, amazing character. And what I really enjoyed learning about your experience together in your book, something that I didn't know, was that you were planning on opening a bed and breakfast together.
In Belize.
Exactly. So Frank had this dream.
Yes.
He built a cardboard model of a house
Yes.
that he wanted to build. But
Yes.
there was a change in his thinking. What happened to make him change the plan that was apparently a dream that he decided to take a different route for?
Right. Well, we went to Belize to scout out the place, right? And we fell massively in love with it. So I went back home to Fort Lauderdale, and Frank stayed an additional few weeks to try to scope out where we would build what, etc. Right. And so one evening he was in a bar having a drink with a Belizean gentleman, and they were about the same age, and they got to talking about cowboy movies because apparently there's a station in Belize that beams cowboy movies, right? So they had that in common. So the gentleman said to him, so what do the Badlands look like, man? Because you know a lot of cowboy movies were shot in the Badlands. And Frank said, I don't know. And the man was like, you're American, right? And Frank said, yes, but I've never been to the Badlands. And then the guy said, okay, well, what about the Grand Canyon? What does Grand Canyon look like? And Frank had to once again say, I don't know. So the man gave up. He was like, what kind of American are you exactly? So when Frank came home, he said to me, honey, we related that experience. And he said, honey, you know, we can't go to Belize or anywhere because we don't know our own country. And, you know, what if we're in Belize and people are asking us all these questions and we have to keep saying, I don't know. So he said, why don't we take a couple of months off and drive around the country and visit these places that millions of people from all over the world come to see, and it's in our backyard and we don't know. And that's was the beginning of our incredible adventure, which continues today.
It is. And again, what I really thought was fascinating about that story is that it was a 180-degree turnaround from a single conversation, or at the very least, it started him rethinking about his relationship with his own country. I'm
Yes.
paraphrasing what he said or what you quoted him as saying in the book, in that he didn't feel that he had the same relationship with America as other people do. And
Right.
one of the ways that he wanted to correct that with you was to be able to travel around his own country and visit it. What was that first trip like? What can you tell us about that first experience traveling around the country with Frank in your F-150 pickup truck?
Heaven, heaven. You know, at the end of that 2 month period, 12,500 miles later, Frank said, honey, I think we're going to make it because we did not have one blow up the entire time. He said, if you can be in a truck with somebody for 8 weeks, right, and not fall out, we're going to make it. So it was unbelievable. You know, we had no itinerary, and I actually did not even know where we were going most of the time. I just left that up to Frank. But the first unbelievably drop dead go to heaven place that we came to was Acadia National Park, right, in Maine. And you know, driving up on top of Cadillac Mountain, I tell people it's a stone-faced mountain. You've been there, right? This,
I have not.
well, that's waiting for you.
Yes.
This stone-faced mountain, right? It's very turgid, and around its base is a forest, so it looks like a giant with a hula skirt, right? And as we're driving up the mountain, and I realize we're above the clouds now. We're looking down at the clouds, but we're still on Earth, right? And then we're deposited in this incredibly unearthly place of such beauty. I literally thought I must have died and gone to heaven, because the earth that I was accustomed to see, nothing that I knew looked like this, right? As far as the eye could see, there was no evidence of the human touch. On one side, the Atlantic was just thundering onto the rocky shores, and the gulls were diving and screeching. And on the other side, I don't know, it was like a very calm body of water that was interspersed with islands and treed islands. And then the setting sun turned that water into gold. Ha! I was like, ha, ha, right? And I literally, in that moment, I had such a, how do you say, epiphany, because I felt like the very same entity that I was looking out at had made what I was looking out at, right? The very same entity that made me. And so, as that was beautiful and perfect, I must be beautiful and perfect too. And so I fell in love with myself on top of Cadillac Mountain. But on top of that, I fell in love with the whole entire world. Since that day, I have seen nothing but beauty and perfection. And I really try to hold that even with the people who challenge me. I'm not going to call any names, but you have to work at loving some people. But I realize that the moment I start pointing a finger, right, bunch pointing back at me. So I must always hold everybody in the same context of perfection. But then as we continued around the country to the Badlands, I mean, when we got to the Badlands, Frank and I were talking, and then we turned a corner and we were stopped in our tracks like, huh? Because how could this place be Earth again? Because the Earth had gathered itself up into temples and pyramids and spires. It looked like Egypt. Frank said, it looks just like Angkor Wat, right? The temples of Angkor Wat. I mean, indescribably beautiful. And as we continued around the country, now it was when we got to Yellowstone, and when we were in Yellowstone and we saw this Yellowstone National Park, I was like, okay, I saw Acadia National Park, Badlands National Park, now Yellowstone National Park. What the heck is a national park? And once I found out the answer to that question, I freaked out. I was like, what? How is this possible that I'm a college educated person and I didn't know about this? And then there were no Black people and no brown people either, except for people from Asia, perhaps, you know? And as we continued around the country to places like, well, no, we went across the country to Washington State, an Olympic National Park, and then came back down through Yosemite and Grand Canyon. Oh my goodness. Even today, as I'm speaking about it, my eyes and my soul are filled and imprinted with beauty.
And what I found really fascinating, and what it really is inspiring to me, is how you immediately dove into advocacy. You know, I think that a lot of people would roll off an event like that and just have had a great personal experience, but it seemed like you really wanted to put yourselves into the role of environmental protection. What was it like in the early days when you were just starting to do the work of getting involved with nonprofit organizations like the Audubon Society, like the National Park Conservation Association? What was that early experience like, breaking into these cultural, social environments that were predominantly white facing?
Well, it was very funny. The first time we went to a meeting of the Sierra Club, a very bubbly, wonderful lady welcomed us and said, so what brings you here? To which Frank said, my truck. You know, because what do you mean, what brings me here? You know, I have a right to be here and anywhere. We always say we're citizens of the world. So, you know, we belong everywhere. And then, of course, they were talking about, you know, environmental protection. Then the next big thing was we were also members of the Audubon Society of Broward County. In fact, Frank became their president at one point. And this night we went to a meeting, and this young woman from the Audubon Society, the Miami office, came to talk about Everglades restoration. And this huge project that she said would take 20 years, cost $5 billion, but was vitally important to the survival of South Florida. And then she said those magical words. She said, but the extent to which it will succeed will depend upon how the Black and Hispanic citizens embrace it. So Frank and I were looking at each other like with stars in our eyes, like, we can do that. We can do that. We can help, we can help people, help share what it really means with people, right? Well, come to find out, there was a lot of talk about that, but there was never any budget, never any real, never any real effort. It took us a couple of years before we finally got a contract with the Audubon Society, a director named Stuart Strahl, who had just come back from Central America, and I suspect he was more accustomed to dealing with people of color. And I will never forget the day a lady from the EPA actually said to Frank and me, and she loved us. She said, oh, you people can't afford to get involved with the environment because you have so many survival issues, like pay the rent and the light bill, and it's just all so much. And I'm standing in front of her and there's steam coming out of my ears because, lady, I probably know more about this environment than you, okay? And I'm standing in front of you, okay, with offering us and our expertise, because Frank was in business and I was in communications, so we could do this. But for a long time, people couldn't see that. It was very frustrating. But you know what? We didn't let that stop us.
Mm.
We
Now,
just kept going.
was there a breakthrough moment? I mean, because you've been advocates for the environment for a very long time, but was there a particular time when you felt like you had broken through and got the attention that you deserve to address these important issues?
No, no. And this morning I posted that I'm freaking out a little bit. You know why?
Why?
Because the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, just issued a report, was it last week or this week, right? In which they talked about the extremely dire situation that we're facing in terms of climate and climate breakdown, right? And I am not seeing that that message is being picked up in the general public. To my way of thinking, by now we heard about climate change back in 1997, and since then we have been observing it and following the literature, but also seeing it play out in real life. So I'm thinking that if the environmental sector, led by predominantly white environmentalists, had been able to embrace the racially diverse people who wanted to help bring the message, by now babies should be coming out ready to recycle and say, hey, like, let's reduce emissions, right? It's been 27 years. Instead, we're still faltering along, tottering along, like we have time to spare. So I don't really think that we have come anywhere near close to putting the amount of value and importance upon dealing with the environment, getting everybody, I see the national parks as the keystone, as the entrance, right? So you go to a national park and your spirit is really caught up with the beauty, and you see the great expanse of nature, and you know what the world used to look like before we changed it so dramatically, right? And so you're inspired to try to bring more of that to the public, to say, we have things to save. We have things to, I don't want to say build upon, because we don't want to build upon them. But, we have an ethic to increase, and that is the ethic of conservation and reducing emissions, because the way we're headed, in another 10 years, the IPCC says we might not be able to stave off the worst consequences by then. And they say we still have time to do that. So let's get to it.
Wow. Well, it's safe to say that you've been at this for a while, and I know personally, you and I met back in 2008, and that was when you created the Breaking the Color Barrier to the Outdoors conference in Atlanta.
Right.
And I loved it because, I mean, you made it possible for me to meet folks like Juan Martinez and Carolyn Finney and Rue Mapp and all these people that have done so much, to move all this forward. But that was 15 years ago.
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
and I'm really curious to know if you think, at least relative to the people of color who are now staunchly part of this movement, how much have things changed? I mean, are things different today than they were 15 years ago?
Oh,
And
dramatically different. Yes. Yes. And also precisely because of the people, some of the people you cite, and the once communities got a hold of this knowledge that there are these very special places and that we're connected to them, that we have history in them, because that's one of the things that we help share as well. The fact that practically all of American history and therefore Black American history is in the national parks where the historic sites where history happened, are protected. So, girl trek, brown girls climb, brown girls hike. I see that you have a group of Black men who are, outdoorsmen bicycling. There are so many groups. Oh, Soul Fire Farm. In every category of outdoor activity and advocacy, you can now find groups of color pursuing their dreams and helping to integrate the movement.
that, I think, was kind of a resurgence of the movement that had started even back in the 70s. I really think that you and Frank helped to revitalize all of that. And again, much of the work that I've been doing over the last 15 years was directed by much of the work that you started. And I'm curious to know, I mean, what does the future look like? I mean, what do you imagine if we are successful in engaging as we have to a higher degree? What needs to change, in your opinion, to create an environment where we can have diversity, equity, and inclusion in the management of public land, and so that everybody is engaged and involved in efforts to mitigate the causes of climate change?
Yes. And I'm going to answer it from a slightly different way, right?
Okay.
So, mm, so after Katrina, a few years after Katrina, I was at an event in Atlanta where a group of young people were graduating from an environmental institute that our friend Nataki Osborne Jazz, right, had initiated. And the guest speaker had come in from New Orleans. And he said these fateful words. He actually said that before Hurricane Katrina came, he had gone out in a helicopter with city leaders and members of the Army Corps of Engineers. And they had observed that if a Category 5 storm hit, there was no way the levee could hold. So they were preparing for a catastrophic event. And so you know what they did? They bought body bags. Instead of telling the people, they bought body bags and put them in storage. And that story freaked me out beyond belief. And then I looked it up and I saw on CNN that they'd actually had to buy more body bags because of the severity of the storm and the loss of life. All right, so fast forward to 2016 when I'm at an environmental conference in Miami. And this conference is about Everglades restoration. I had been going to that conference since 1997, and I had taken a 10-year hiatus. And when I went back to the conference, it was the same white people sitting together talking about the same things, buying land, to protect the Everglades, etc. And nobody was dealing with the issue of sea level rise that was really, becoming more imminent. So after that, I wrote a story and I said, body bags plague my vision at this conference. And one of the leaders actually called me and remonstrated with me and said, I shouldn't have done that because it was irresponsible. And I'm saying, hello, maybe you're irresponsible for not warning people what's going to happen. And then last year, right, when Hurricane Ian came on the west coast of Florida, it actually took people out in their homes, out to sea. You don't really see that much about that, but that's what happened. So I'm saying to people, we have a choice right now. We all have got to wake up and come together or to do our part, whatever we identify that part as being. We have to go to the zoning and planning meetings. We have to know what's happening at City Hall. Because I'm saying, if those people in New Orleans had known that the decisions being taken at the zoning meeting, right, that allowed those barrier islands to be decimated, those barrier islands that would have, helped to, inhibit the damage, right? Would they have taken a few hours out of their week or their month and gone to City Hall or the zoning and planning meeting and insisted that, look, we need those things for protection. You cannot do that. We will not have you do that. And I think that that is the kind of thing that's going to be needed now and into the future, not just in terms of park and outdoor recreation, but in terms of protecting the environment and keeping us from going to that 1.5 emissions, 1.5 centigrade thing that is going to be could literally be the decimate our population. Let's just put it that way. It's an all hands on deck moment.
That's a fascinating perspective. And it's interesting because I think that we've all been talking about the potential catastrophic impacts of doing nothing. And it's clear to me that there are ways that we can take direct action. In fact, you, myself, several other of our colleagues put together in 2016 an organization called the Next 100 Coalition. And that was something that I was really proud to be a part of, because by 2017, we were successful in having then President Obama sign a presidential memorandum on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the management of public land. But unfortunately, that happened at the end of his administration, and by the next administration, it went away. Right. And I remember being in Washington with you, talking to a representative of the Department of Interior, and it was clear that they were prepared to do absolutely nothing. And so then 4 years later, we have a new administration. Can this administration or even another administration do things proactively to correct some of the ill effects of everything that we're dealing with in the environment right now?
Well, I applaud the Biden administration's 30 by 30, to conserve 30% of our land and waters by the year 2030. But I think they're overlooked. I don't know how plugged in you are, but I think a lot of us are overlooked as a resource to help get that done. It's like environment is a predominantly white thing, and it cannot succeed as a predominantly white thing because white Americans are only about 50% of the population now, right? So even if every white person was, seriously engaged, that would still leave half of the population unengaged, right? And I just really wish that the environmental organizations and the administration would see the benefit of supporting grassroots and diverse environmental leaders so that we can bring the message to a wider swath of the population. Because a lot of people of color still unfortunately think it's a white people thing, environment, right? Because, it's just people who have time and money to waste, even though we can see the ravages of climate change around us. But still we can ignore it because, so many other people are ignoring it. And then again, when the effects come, we know it's going to always affect, people of color and under-resourced people worse than anybody else because we have less opportunity to respond, less resources with which to respond.
Well, it's always the people on the margins that are going to be most disproportionately impacted by the catastrophic effects of things like climate change, like severe weather events. And that has literally nothing to do with race as much as it does with lack of resources, to be disenfranchised for a variety of different reasons. But I personally think, and I think you agree, that much of that is part of why it's important to be able to make sure that the environments that we live in are allowed to be safe and remain sound. I've got just one more question, but I really want to make sure that the audience has an opportunity to participate in the few minutes that we have left towards the end of the hour. Please, if you've got a question, if there's anything that you'd like to ask or share, please share them in the comments or raise your hand and I will happily call on you. One of the things that I think is, again, remarkable is that you have returned to your home in Jamaica after living in the United States for so long. First of all, what prompted this move? Because I know that you've been all over the place. You and Frank were living on a boat for a while. You know, when I first met you, you were living in Atlanta, then you moved back to Florida. Why did you decide to move back to Jamaica?
Well, it was 2018 and the political climate in the US was so toxic. And Frank and I had bought this boat, a motor sailor, right? With I can't even remember the capacity now, but that thing could go to Africa, no problem. And it was our intention to sail around the world because that had always been his dream. But then my mom got ill, and as an only child, I had to stay to be on call, right? And it took me a year after she passed away in 2017 before I realized, wait a minute, I don't have to wait on her calling me anymore because she's never going to call again. She will never need my help again. And that's when I said to Frank, how about we sell the boat? Because, you know, upkeep and a boat is work and I don't really like to work. So how about we sell the boat and then go to Jamaica, where we'd always vacationed at my friend's estate, where she had a number of cottages that were fully furnished, right? Even down to the wine glasses and dish towels. So we said, you know, let's just sell everything and give away what we don't want and just go live there. So we did that. And that's when I wrote the book. And then I wrote the book in 2019 and actually published it in 2019. But then after the pandemic kind of put a stop to everything. So last year, I realized that a number of dramatic things had taken place, including Hurricane Ian, and I needed to update the book to include that. So I did. And I also put 10 pointers in there, 10 tips at the end that people can do, you know, on a personal basis. And one of the first things is find out as much as you can and then be talking to your community, talk to your church, talk to your school, talk at your office. We really need to elevate this conversation about climate change and how we're going to, you know, address it. Right. But, you know, I really feel like there's a divine hand in my life because as much as I love parks, imagine I came back to Jamaica and found an apartment. My friend found us an apartment in which our balcony and all our windows face the Blue Mountains, which contain our Blue and John Crow Mountains National Park and World Heritage Site, baby, which means it's of significance to the entire world. And I reached out to the local park managers and they have been so receptive towards me. So I'm so grateful. I'm really now striving to help them bring more information because they're very science focused and people don't necessarily, you know, the public doesn't necessarily focus on the science. So I want to tell them about the beauty and the culture and the history and how much they can derive, how many benefits they can derive from being in the park and supporting the park. So I'm ecstatic. It's unbelievably wonderful.
Wow. So you'd mentioned that Frank is finally retiring.
Yes.
And I shared with you earlier, and I'll share it with the audience, all the hardest working people I know are all retired. I'm sure that Frank is still continuing to stay socially and politically active. Because I know Frank. But what are you up to? How are you working and spending your days as a writer and an activist in your beautiful home now in Jamaica?
Well, one thing I'm striving to do is get the book into people's hands, right? And I am really pushing it from my website, audreypeterman.com, because I don't know if you're aware, many of the mass marketers don't really reward writers with a significant percentage of what your book sells for. So I'm really striving to get a market, expand the market for the book. At the same time, I write prolifically on social media, sharing political and social justice events, but always putting in a commentary so that, you know, putting it in context and encouraging people to take action. I also write a blog. It's subscription based. It's called The Joy Train and it comes out on Mondays. and Fridays, in which I strive to share stories and experiences, my own experiences that bring me joy and encourage people to find joy in their life also by participating in the public discourse and becoming part of the solution. And I started that in February of last year when I heard that Deepak Chopra, he's a spiritualist and
Yes.
philosopher, and he
Mhm.
said we need a pandemic of joy to counteract the negative effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I was like, well, Joy is my middle name, so I can do that. So that's when I started it.
No, I
Mhm.
love that. Well, as the creator of the Joy Trip Project, you know that I'm 100% behind,
Yes,
any effort to proliferate joy.
right.
And again, what I'm really enjoying about this conversation, is the positive attitude that we can continue to bring to this really important work, because
Yeah.
it's easy to get mired down in cynicism and fear and anger and anxiety and a wide variety of other things. And I'm not even 100% sure if this is a fair question to ask you, but what is it that brings you joy today? I mean, what is it that keeps you, motivated and inspired to continue to do this important work?
Well, first of all, I have 20 grandchildren and 5 great grandchildren. Okay. And you remember that there's a part in the book where my girlfriend from high school and I are walking on the beach in Fort Lauderdale, and she's walking ahead of me and she hears me scream and she runs back thinking, I might have found gold on the beach. And in fact, I showed her a little daffodil, a little flower that was growing in the sand. So I'm very attuned to nature. And where I'm living right now, where we're living, the expanse of nature that I can see is so vast. So I cannot, if I open my eyes, or even if I have my eyes closed and I have the imprint of such beauty on my mind, I'm happy. I can't not be happy. I can't not be happy.
And again, it's that sense of optimism that I think is critically important, because, truthfully, I think that, despite the fact that we're both purveyors of social media, we can get mired down, by all the negative things that are out there and all the things that are making it hard for us to stay positive. And personally, I think being able to be outside in nature and to be able to move our bodies and breathe fresh air is how we stay in tuned and motivated to continue this really very, very important work. And as we move forward in all these conversations, what I'm hoping is that, we can come to perhaps an understanding as to how we will do this important work together and collectively. And so, for all the people who are on this call, and all the folks that are engaged in these very important conversations, I want to make sure that, as we're moving these issues forward, we're figuring out the things that we can do. And you mentioned, and I was going to point out the list of things that you have, that you suggest in your book. Can you share just a couple of the things that you mentioned in your book that you suggest to everybody to do in order to move this conversation forward?
Yes, yes. The first one being have learning more, right? Having the conversations, elevating the conversations, talking to your elected officials. I mean, not being afraid to speak on the issue because it's life or death.
Mm.
In your own personal life, becoming an advocate, activist, doing the basic things like walking more or bicycling, not adding to the emissions, using renewable energy things as much as possible. One thing I suggest to people is get familiar with what's around you. Learn how to boil water, how to make a fire and boil water and purify water. Learn what's in the environment around you that is edible. For example, I know everything that's around me here. If push came to shove, I could feed us off of this land. Now, I know that's not going to be true for everybody, but there are some basic skills and talents that we need to develop because in the future, we're going to need to use them. I'm pretty sure of that.
Mm.
Let's just say I'm convinced of that.
Well, I'm totally convinced of that myself. Again, I want to make sure that if anyone has a question in the audience, that you will take the time to ask it. My friend Barbara actually has a question. Barbara, would you like to unmute your microphone and ask your question?
Hi, Barbara.
Hi. I am so happy to be here and to meet you and to, have some time with you. I was in Jamaica once, many, many, many years ago. I'm also 71 and retired. So I'm loving this. I'm loving this. You're going to be going on for a long time. I can see it now. And so my question would be, if I am making it because I love what you're saying, to visit natural parks and the national parks. And I've learned a lot already through what James is doing, just in terms of reading. I joined a birding group, and I've learned about different birds, and I'm watching them on my feeder. And so one way is, if I do travel, I want to make sure that I visit the national park that's there, or the national parks, and really venture out. And so I'm just wondering, if I made a trip to Jamaica, where would you recommend?
Oh, we only have one national park. It's the Blue and John Crow Mountains. So that's Kingston. But then you'd have to come see me and I'll take you.
I would love that.
And
I wasn't looking for that, but I think,
Truly. And you know what? That park has a cloud forest, right? That only I think like between 2 and 5% of tropical forests have a cloud forest. You're up there and then suddenly the clouds and you're enshrouded. Yes, and the number of species of birds and the flora and fauna that's up there. I think we have like almost 30 endemic species that live nowhere else on Earth.
Wow. And see, this is the kind of thing you're talking about that I think we would educate people, because oftentimes people go into a place, they go to the shopping, they go to, buying trinkets, and they leave and they don't really appreciate, because we've not been taught to do that. We have not. And so wanting to do that more and more, and teaching my children who are grown, they're in their 30s, but the water, the lakes, we got to take care of that, protect that. But I think my new bucket list item is getting back to Jamaica, now that I know there's a special place.
Oh, it's so special. And I'd be so delighted to take you there. Yes.
I'll be on your website to get your book.
Fantastic. Thank you.
And I will make it a point to introduce you at some point, because Audrey is the person that you would want to have your guide if you're planning on going.
I would love it. No one else. It would be you. If we make it there, it'd be you. Okay, I'll let other people talk. Thank you so much.
Nice. Well, Cheryl has a question. Cheryl, I doubt it's that loud in your house. I bet if you were to unmute your microphone and share your question, Audrey would be happy to answer it for it.
Hi, Cheryl.
Hi. Good to see you. And Audrey knows my noisemakers other than the dog. So hopefully you'll forgive us if it gets rowdy. But yes, I was just wondering, I feel like the world is just so polarized right now. And I know we've had some different strategies we've tried over the years to connect with people who may not see eye to eye with us. But do you have any your top tip that you would give to those of us who feel like we're hitting our head against the wall sometime with elected officials and citizens who just don't have the same values about the environment?
Yes, and I'm so glad that you asked that, because I am for putting the information out. And as even to my elected officials, I'm going to be very direct if I see that they're not taking to what I am saying, which is factual. And here's a quote that I love to use. Vice President Al Gore used it in his in Inconvenient Truth. He quotes Upton Sinclair. You can wake a man who is sleeping, but you cannot wake a man or a person who's pretending to be asleep. Okay? So I really am spending less time now trying to knock my head against the wall for people who are not interested, people who really have their ears closed. My time and my energy, way too important. So I'm going to leave the information with the elected officials, and then I'm going to go tell members of his constituency, this is what is happening. Okay, so you need to respond to this and reach out to your your elected official. Now, I know that we're in an era that is referred to as post-truth because everybody can make up their own truth. But here's what doesn't change. The environment doesn't lie. The land doesn't lie. The environment is not playing games with us, okay? So all these people can go on trying to play games like they're really, interested when they're not, or be obstructive when they shouldn't be. They can go on and do that. But I have to try to rouse the people who will come along and strive to make a difference. I'm not going to be knocking my head against the brick wall. Sorry. And
I love that. And I love that mindset.
You should
That
change
changes
your
the
beautiful
perspective.
head.
That's right.
Because it's not going to change. If it's not going to change them, what's the point? Move on to the next person and the next, and the next.
Awesome, Cheryl. Thank you so much for your question. Well, we have 2 minutes left in the hour, and I'm going to thank everyone for joining us this evening. I want to say thank you very much to Audrey. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, please make sure that you get a copy of her book. It is From My Jamaica Gully to the World and Back. And she's back there now, but she's looking to open up the world to a wider cross-section of the importance of environmental protection. So please give it a read. I think you'll love to hear her entire story. Also, I wanted to say thank you because author discussions on the Joyship Reading Project are made possible thanks to the support of the Schleck Family Foundation, the National Geographic Society, and the National Park Service in partnership with Together Outdoors and the University of Wisconsin-Madison Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. Now, I hope that you will join us next month on April 27th. Mark your calendars because our guest will be Leah Peterman and her amazing book, Black Earth Wisdom, in which Audrey and I are both quoted. So we both have an interest and inclination to read this, and so I hope that you'll pick up a copy at your next opportunity. For now, I want to say thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I welcome you to come back, and we hope to see you again next month. Until then, take care and have a great evening. Good night, everyone. Keep reading.
So much. Bless you. Thank you. Thank you.